Hello, everyone. Thank you for choosing to view our presentation. I want to say thanks to Angela Miller and Carla Ferretto, Division 15 chairs, and thank everyone for coming to APA 2021. This paper concerns a chapter in the Handbook of Educational Psychology, edited by Angela O'Donnell and Johnmarshall Reeve, co-authored with Diane Lamb. Diane was at Stanford University when we wrote this. She's currently at a startup called Berkeley Lights. I'm a professor with the Learning Sciences program at Indiana University. You can see my email address there. I hope you'll email me if you have any questions about our presentation. I'm currently supported by a grant from the National Science Foundation with my co-investigators, Phil Piety, Elizabeth Monsignor, and Derek Hansen. So this chapter and this presentation are all about transfer. Well, why study transfer? I'll draw on a quote from the late Randy Engel, who was very influential in the work that I do and in this chapter. Basically, the bottom line is otherwise instruction is wasted, right? If people can't transfer what they've learned to subsequent educational, professional, personal contexts, there's really no point in instruction. The National Research Council does these regular expert consensus reports. This particular one was led by Jim Pellegrino. They bring together groups of experts and very carefully reach consensus on important issues. They concur that the transfer is important, but they point out that research suggests that knowledge does not transfer very readily. And that issue is really what this chapter and this presentation are all about. Assumptions about transfer really have a profound impact on education via their influence on educational assessments and achievement tests. I'll be focusing on the former while acknowledging the latter. In most settings, assessments and tests are really proxies for transfer, right? It's very difficult to actually assess genuine transfer, and so tests and assessments really are used to estimate whether or not transfer is likely. Our goal in this chapter, in this presentation, really is to respond to this broad interest and concern over what has typically been referred to as culturally relevant education. There's really a broad consensus that deficit-based responses to historical and continuing inequities and injustices in education just don't work. And there's broad support for asset-based responses. The most notable of these are funds of knowledge, and the newer version of that, funds of identity. This followed from the work of Louise Moll and colleagues on the border in the US that showed that in predominantly Hispanic schools, even Hispanic teachers were not drawing on the cultural and linguistic knowledge that students were bringing, but rather were drawing on mainstream white examples and contexts. And these are widely used. Funds of Identity is a newer version that takes into account some of the newer digital representations and more current research on the identities that students bring with them. Rebecca Neary and colleagues, Maritza Lozano and Luis Gomez, in a Review of Educational Research article, asserted that it's not even mildly controversial to suggest that in order to successfully teach non-dominant students, all their teachers should possess practical pedagogies that effectively draw on the racial, ethnic, linguistic, and cultural asset that these learners bring to school. This is debatable at this point. There is certainly controversy in the current climate. It's pretty clear that in some settings, efforts to bring asset-based responses into schools may run into controversy. They may be incorrectly labeled as critical race theory. I'm not going to get into that issue other than acknowledge it and suggest that doing so in the context of assessment and testing is likely to be controversial, likely more controversial than efforts to do so in the context of pedagogy. They further argued that the muted response to culturally relevant education is due to teacher resistance, which they characterize as a multi-level problem. So if we think about this, there's really some clear levels we can identify. One is obviously pedagogy. The second, which I'll be focusing on today, is classroom formative and summative assessment, which itself has, as I've just mentioned, two levels, formative and summative. There's an additional level of data inquiry that Rebecca Neary and Maritza Lozano are studying. There's also, we can talk about it in terms of achievement testing as yet another level. So in our chapter, which is quite long and took about a year to write, we really pushed hard on this issue. We assume that classroom assessment is both an obstacle to culturally relevant education and a promising venue for advancing CRE. Our chapter extended a chapter that I wrote with Jim Pellegrino back in 2005. We draw very strongly from the 2012 special issue of Educational Psychologist on transfer and the transfer strand in the Journal of Learning Sciences. So we examined the implications of 4 dimensions of assessment for transfer and CRE. This was assessment format, assessment level, assessment function, and learning theory. And those are the 4 primary sections that we'll be exploring in this talk. We first explore the implications of each of these dimensions for transfer and then for CRE. This is intended to lay the groundwork for culturally sustaining educational assessment, which attempts to go beyond culturally relevant. And importantly, to uncover the complex interaction between these dimensions. We argue in our chapter that these dimensions interact with each other in complex ways that actually are not well understood by some researchers and many practitioners, and that if we attain the goal of culturally sustaining assessment, that we need to address these interactions. This presentation will be relatively long. The chapter is long. It's got 3 parts, just to give you an idea of where we're going here. The first part, we'll look at each of these 4 dimensions of assessment and consider their implications first for transfer and then for culturally sustaining assessment. So the second part, we'll review sort of the evolving cognitive theories of transfer, both historical and contemporary, as well as emerging situative theories, and consider a recent critique of situative theories that inspires part 3, which is really this model of culturally sustaining assessment, which introduces these 4 levels of classroom assessment. So first we have assessment format. This is a familiar distinction between sort of selected response, such as multiple choice, and constructed response formats, as well as essay, performance, portfolio, etc. Many cognitive scientists argue that all selected response formats and most constructed response formats can't really assess FAR transfer. The assumption here is that multiple choice items, because of the nature that you're selecting a response, that they're really only assessing sort of lower level associations. And that transfer assessments really require active problem solving, is typically captured in sort of more complex multi-part performance assessments. This assumption has long been debated among measurement theorists. Our work brings a newer perspective to this from situative theory that suggests otherwise, that in fact in some settings, multiple choice achievement test may be the most appropriate measure and the most pragmatic way to estimate transfer. Bransford and Schwartz influentially argued that any measure of what they called sequestered problem solving can't really assess transfer. And that article really helped me appreciate John Bransford was on my doctoral committee, and when I did a very nice natural experiment of the Jasper Woodbury, a socio-constructivist innovation for teaching math problem solving, I was able to document a pretty massive impact on the ITPS math problem solving scores. And for a while I was really befuddled why Bransford wasn't that impressed by those results. And now I understand that, and came to understand that he really just doesn't believe that the ITPS problem solving measures capture it because of the use of multiple choice formats. Again, I differ on that. I actually think that was an effective measure, and as I'll discuss, I continue to think that well-constructed achievement tests, if they've not been directly taught to, can provide valid estimates of transfer. So what's the intersection between assessment format and culturally sustaining assessment? There isn't actually really that much discussion of of assessment in the culturally relevant education literature, other than criticism of selected response formats as manifested in standardized achievement tests. Some of these scholars argue that diverse students need diverse opportunities to demonstrate what they know. Jennifer Randall and others have argued convincingly that the way that achievement tests are created to be ostensibly culturally neutral actually bias uh, test towards white manifestations and white representations of knowledge. And that's a very important argument. I'm not going to get into it too much in this talk, but I do want to acknowledge it. I think it's very important, and I think that Jennifer Randall is doing incredible work in this regard. But we are left with an open question whether standardized formats, i.e. multiple choice formats, can and should be used to evaluate schooling. So this gets us into this notion of culturally sustaining practices. They're more than responsive or relevant. In the words of Django Paris, it requires that they support young people in sustaining the cultural and linguistic competence of their communities while simultaneously offering access to dominant cultural competence. So you can say what you want about achievement tests. We can argue whether they should or shouldn't be changed, but it's unmistakable, it's unavoidable that gaining access to the kinds of knowledge that are represented on those tests are crucial to taking advantage of valued opportunities in terms of college entrance exams, employment exams, and the like. Moving on to assessment levels. Most assessment scholars recognize these 5 levels. At the immediate level, these are assessments that are embedded in instruction, such as the assessment of classroom discourse. Most would say that there's not really evidence of transfer. However, they can play a crucial role of examining whether students transfer in their prior experience. At the next level, we have activity-oriented assessments. These are often formative assessments at this level. There's some debate over whether anything that is activity-oriented can capture transfer, whether it's removed enough from the learning environment to provide estimates of transfer. And this is where we get at a complex interaction. Within the CRE literature, there's a lot of calls to use alternative formats to assess learning. One of the issues is that the way that performance and portfolio assessments are designed and used, they're ostensibly proximal level or curriculum oriented and intended to be estimates of transfer. But in fact, they're so close to the curriculum that they're actually at the close level and therefore not really providing evidence, at least of far transfer and maybe not even near transfer. At the proximal level is where we're really beginning to get at evidence of learning that would be consistent with what most people would characterize as transfer. In classrooms, these are typically summative assessments that are used to assign grades. So to reiterate, the proximal level is oriented towards the curriculum rather than the activities, and so you're beginning to get something which most people would agree is evidence of transfer. At the distal level, you're really standards oriented. You're assessing knowledge that's aligned to the particular standards you're targeting, independent of the way that instruction was delivered. These are consistent with tests that are often used to measure achievement. Such tests are very sensitive to prior learning and non-school factors, which creates huge issues. But to reiterate, at distal level is where we're really getting evidence of transfer in a lot of transfer research where performance assessments are used. Such assessments have to be shown to be sort of examined interpretively to make sure that they actually are different enough from the learning environment to indeed be evidence of transfer. Finally, at the remote level, these are tests that are designed and implemented in a way that allows them to carefully document differences over time, such as in the National Assessment of Educational Progress in the US, or between countries, such as in the PISA program. These are relevant to the current discussion because they're often used to document racial achievement gaps. Mueller in 2001 showed that in the National Assessment of Educational Progress that African American 12th graders were achieving at levels that were very similar to Asian American and Euro American 8th graders. So what does levels have to do with culturally sustaining assessment? So as we'll discuss later, these levels are very central to our vision of culturally sustaining assessment. As we mentioned, immediate level assessments of discourse, those can ensure that students are transferring in relevant funds of knowledge and identity and using them. Then the close level formative assessments can be used to ensure that students are connecting their funds of knowledge and identity with course content and making sense of them. We further contend that at the proximal level, grading students, that the teachers should really hold all students accountable for diverse ways of knowing. Now, we want to acknowledge that this is likely to encounter resistance. Certainly, I was very shaped in my work at the Center for Performance Assessment at ETS in the 1990s, witnessing the wholesale collapse of portfolio and performance assessment due to political concerns in the 1990s. And certainly, culturally sustaining distal achievement tests are likely to encounter fierce resistance. At minimum, we think that we should acknowledge that culturally neutral tests are actually biased. I'll return to this point a little later. So moving on to our third dimension, this concerns the purposes or functions of assessment. Traditionally, such as with the National Research Council, you've seen a focus on assessment purposes, the familiar summative, formative, and evaluative purposes. This leads to a concern over assessments serving multiple purposes, typically in the way that the summative purposes undermine formative purposes. When you embrace a more situative perspective on assessment, as I do, you shift to a focus on assessment functions. This emphasizes systemic validity and the unintended consequences of assessment practices. This allows you to assign multiple functions to a given assessment. And this is really important because it allows you, for example, to, as we do, to have close level assessments that summatively assess engagement while simultaneously formatively assessing understanding. I've learned over the years that this is one aspect of our framework and a sociocultural approach to assessment that traditional assessment scholars really have the hardest time assessing. And this is because a sociocultural perspective gives you a broader view of learning, that engagement is one form of learning, understanding is a form of learning, achievement is a form of learning. When you embrace this broader view and focus on functions, there's a lot of different ways of thinking about assessment that I think are crucial to transforming assessment. Torrance, also writing from a sociocultural perspective, argued convincingly that all assessment is formative, but not necessarily in a positive way. And Torrance introduced these three additional functions that are central to the arguments we're making. Conformative functions, this is assessment as compliance, referring to the way that the narrow representations of knowledge that are necessary to make assessments that are reliable and efficient, you're really getting students to comply with a much narrower view of knowing than is realistic. Deformative, this refers to the way that feedback, even when associated with formative feedback, can still demoralize students and lead to a negative association with that knowledge that's being assessed. Finally, and most importantly, is this notion of transformative functions. This is when you're thinking about the ways that assessments really transform a learning culture, building on the work, for example, of Laurie Shepard in her influential article, Assessment as a Learning Culture. So, what do assessment functions have to do with culturally sustaining assessment? I think that our goal should be to minimizing conformative and deformative functions while maximizing transformative functions. We believe that a culturally sustaining assessments really need to align culturally sustaining assessment functions across levels. And if that alignment is successful across all levels of assessment, that in doing so can really transform the entire educational ecosystem to be more just and to be more equitable. This is where we get, again, these interactions between functions and learning theory. Our vision of culturally sustaining assessment really doesn't exist outside of situative theory for important reasons that I'll get to. So moving on to our fourth dimension, This is learning theory in its relationship to assessment. So the National Research Council, like many, acknowledge four grand theories of learning, and these distinctions are very important to our arguments. This gets complicated pretty quickly, but they distinguish between differential, behaviorist, cognitivist, and situative. And it's those middle two that are really the important ones for us. Distinguishing between behaviorist and cognitivist sort of implicitly equates associationist perspectives with behaviorism and behaviorist perspectives. In doing so, you have the advantage of sidestepping this enduring debate between cognitive associationist and cognitive constructivist theories. And we argue in our chapter and in our work that this is really problematic. Our chapter runs through, we agree, differential theories. We acknowledge that these are archaic theories that are no longer embraced, this idea that whatever the test measures is learning. But these assumptions live on in part in the machinery of standardized testing that was developed at the beginning of the last century in developing standardized tests and classical test theory. We emphasize the cognitive associationist theory. I don't think it really makes much sense to focus on behaviorist theory, because behaviorist theory outside of special education and classroom management really doesn't have much influence in education anymore. However, cognitive associationist theories, as embodied in the work of Anderson, ActR theory, expository instruction, most MOOCs, they really assume that learning is really the acquisition of very specific associations, of specific cognitive associations. Many equate this theory with selected response formats that are presumed to also measure whether students have these associations that are assumed to transfer fairly readily. That's actually not, we would argue, that is not a correct assumption. Our third theory of learning is cognitive constructivist theory. So it assumes that learning is really the construction of schema when making sense of the world. We think it's important to distinguish between these perspectives because of the enduring tensions between them. The constructivist theory is really antithetical to associationist theory. Now, many equate this theory with performance assessments, and many debates over alternative assessments and assessment reform often are rooted in these tensions between associationist and constructivist perspectives. Finally, situative theory, where we are consistent with the NRCs, really assumes that learning is engaged participation in cultural practices. And many equate situative theory with portfolio assessment. And again, that assumption is not quite accurate in our perspectives. Moving on to part two. So now I'd like to review these sort of both the evolving cognitive models and emerging situative models of transfer and their implications for education and culturally sustaining assessment. The first is this general transfer of general skills. This is rooted in these archaic differential theories and are not really part of the study of transfer, sometimes called formal discipline theory of transfer. The mind is a muscle, right? Teach kids Latin and make them smarter. While it's not really part of transfer research, it's very much part of education in the form of classical education that is increasingly popular. While some of these classical education programs do emphasize diversity and equity in their recruiting and their instruction, many argue that classical education is sort of inherently racist. That's a debatable point, but obviously focusing on Greek and Latin and stuff doesn't leave a lot of room for diversity. Moving on to sort of modern theories, you've got specific transfer of specific associations, right? So this gets us into this question of associationist, whether it's behaviorist or cognitivist. Many, influential Mayer and Whitrock in their handbook chapter on problem-solving transfer, equate this with Thorndike's behaviorist identical elements theory of transfer. In other words, this theory of transfer is specifically behaviorist. However, Singley and Anderson, in their Transfer of Cognitive Skills, in their introduction of transfer from the perspective of ACT theory, they were unabashed in acknowledging their roots in Thorndike, that basically they were replacing the behaviorist stimulus response associations of behaviorism with cognitive sort of if-then associations. So this assumption really lives on in cognitive associationist instruction. You've got your cognitive load theory and your concern with cognitive load and your encouragement of expository forms of instruction. Certainly AI tutors, artificial intelligent tutors, Carnegie tutors, and where you really see the influence is no excuses schools, like the Knowledge is Power program that almost exclusively cater to racial and linguistic minority students. So what does this mean for culturally sustaining practices? Well, we can say what we like about these no excuses schools. They use very harsh disciplinary practices. We can debate the evidence, the claims of improved achievement in light of their exclusionary policies. But we'll say that starting with very specific disciplinary associations, it doesn't really encourage transfer in of knowledge and identity. And this focus on basic skills really doesn't leave a lot of room for diverse perspectives. Moving on, specific transfer of general skills. So this view of transfer is really rooted in Gestalt theory. It's very consistent with cognitive constructivist perspectives. From our perspective, they really invoke Piaget's genetic epistemology, which is quite problematic from a racial perspective, because it argues that the differences we see in achievement are really the result of genetics, which has been widely critiqued for its racist implications. The bottom line is this assumption of transfer really doesn't leave a lot of room for asset-based pedagogy. From our perspective, I think that some people are doing interesting work, like Krista Glazewski's work in problem-based learning and in support of equity. Much more broadly is what Mayer and Whitrock labeled cognitive science. And the NRC kind of does it as well with their third category of learning theories. Mayer and Whitrock called this metacognitive control of general and specific skills. What's important here is, like the NRC, Mayer and Whitrock sidestepped this debate over general versus specific transfer, whether what transfers are general schema or specific associations, and says, yeah, they both transfer. What's notable about this is it supports some diverse but compatible theories of transfer. You've got your motivational theories, Bielanki, Noakes-Millack, additionally Solomon and Perkins in the same Ed Psych article have a motivational theory of transfer in that special issue of Ed Psych. You've got a perceptual view, Rob Goldstone, Day and Goldstone advance this view. And then third, you've got what I characterized as a coordinative view, Dan Schwartz and Bransford, in their contribution to that chapter and a subsequent handbook chapter by Schwartz and Goldstone. There's very little discussion of equity and cultural relevance in all of those treatments of transfer and in much of the treatment of instruction that follows from them. Finally, you got your situative view of transfer that's based on affordances and invariants in the handbook chapter by Greenos, Moore, and Smith in the Transfer on Trial, where they really introduced this theory. We contend that situative theories of transfer has massive implications for equity and cultural relevance, and we're going to focus on them. So to reiterate, situative theory is really rooted in research that was carried out at the Institute for Research on Learning in Palo Alto in the last 2 decades of the last century. Jim Greeno, most obvious proponent, Jean Lave, Alan Collins, John Seeley Brown, and others. Learning from this perspective is really coming to participate in a community of practice. And situative theory really problematizes transfer because it's no longer the straightforward thing that you're carrying sort of knowledge from the learning environment to the transfer environment. Some situative theorists, such as King Beach, reject transfer outright as just being hopelessly cognitivist. Yeah, I'll come back to that point. The important point, and certainly what influenced me immensely in my work, is this idea that invariant properties must be present in both the learning and the transfer environment. And many transfer failures are the result of becoming attuned to the variant properties of the environment and not the invariant properties. And for me, in a decade of work that I did with Paul Hurwitz and Ann Kindfield around the GenScope curriculum, as we documented in our AERJ article, students who had been sort of playing around and doing constructivist engagement in the GenScope genetics environment, well, they were learning about dragons. They were learning, they knew that there was something about gender that impacted whether or not a dragon baby might end up with two wings. So students were being attuned to the variant properties, dragons, wings, of GenScope, but not the invariant properties, sex-linked inheritance, and the way that it works in all species. To reiterate that the invariant property of that environment was the way that sex-linked inheritance worked, but the invariant property was the fact that that affected getting a second wing in breeding dragons. The important thing for us is that situative perspectives allow you to embrace the situative synthesis as articulated in Greeno et al. In 1998. From this perspective, rather than reconciling the difference between individual and social activity by assigning them different levels of aggregation, you treat human information processing and human sense-making as special cases of socially situated activity. For us, the advantage here is this allows us to treat all forms of assessment as special cases of disciplinary discourse, and even in the case of achievement tests, it's sort of a bizarre form of discourse, but a form of discourse nonetheless. So Lobato's introduction to the JLS transfer strand in the Journal of Learning Sciences was an important update to Lave's 1988 situative critique of cognitive models of transfer. She pointed out that the situative alternatives replace the transport metaphor with metaphors such as transformation, production, preparation for future learning. And rather than focusing on abstraction, which is really central to cognitive models of transfer, there were alternative things such as collective, reflective, and actor-oriented transfer, rather than assuming that abstraction is necessary to support transfer. Lobato argued in disagreement with Beach that a transfer mechanism was still necessary, and we agree wholeheartedly with that a transfer mechanism is necessary to propose alternative approaches to assessment. So, Joanne Lobato's actor-oriented theory of transfer, as was summarized in that 2012 special issue, it draws on process causality rather than regular causality. So rather than it explores why and how learning and transfer events are related rather than documenting that they are related. So this is a much more nuanced look at transfer. So there's 5 ways that AOT is different than from mainstream. And from our perspective, these imply cultural relevance, but there's been very little consideration of cultural relevance within actor-oriented transfer. So this is a more interpretive view of knowing. So the view of knowing and therefore learning is a more interpretive view. We're coming from the actors, the individual's point of view. So that opens the door for drawing on funds of knowledge and identity. There's a more holistic conceptualization of content knowledge rather than a more static view of knowledge in cognitive models of transfer. There's more qualitative methods that can capture unanticipated forms of transfer. We think that that has implications. Diverse learners are likely to transfer in diverse ways. And then finally, there are more interpretive goals concerning the nature of transfer rather than the phenomenological goal of documenting transfer. So this is a much broader view. We think that this has implications for culturally sustaining assessment. Importantly, actor-oriented theory is consistent. It has the ultimate goal. Joanne acknowledges that that there is the ultimate goal of a correct perception of mathematics or an expert vision that is the ultimate goal of education. And we think that that's consistent with Paris's notion that we referred to earlier as access to dominant cultural competencies. In our work, the most important situative transfer framework draws on the work of Randy Engel. Her work started with PDE, productive disciplinary engagement. This is a situative framework for characterizing and studying engagement, which led to 4 design principles for fostering PDE, which we contend is really among the most useful and used frameworks and design principles to emerge from situated cognition. Subsequently, Randy and colleagues, including Diane Lamb, in the special issue, introduced this idea of expansive framing. This is a new set of design principles for framing instruction to support transfer. So this is in contrast with bounded framing, the sort of expository, unframed instruction that's really bounded by itself, where you're just teaching concepts sort of in isolation, or what we've been characterizing in our work as expert framing, problem-based learning, and other more cognitive constructivist approaches where experts define frames that they think will be ideal for supporting expert understanding. Expansive framing pragmatically pushes students to make numerous personalized connections with content to form what linguists refer to as intercontextuality. So you want to contextualize learning by having students consider people, places, topics, and times beyond the boundaries of the instruction or the course to make those connections. In doing so, you position students as authors rather than consumers of disciplinary knowledge who are participating in an extended conversation that takes place over time. This idea has framed my work for really the past 10 years. It is a complicated one. We've been working to communicate it broadly. And as we argue in a practitioner-oriented publication recently, while the idea here is complex, the basic idea is simple. If you want students to use ideas they are learning in the future, i.e. transfer, they must discuss doing so while they are learning those ideas. Importantly for us is this brilliant critique of PDE, and we argue by extension expansive framing from Priya Agarwal and Tesha Sengupta-Irving. First off, they acknowledge that PDE, and again by extension expansive framing, is more likely to be more inclusive than traditional instruction. In particular, it's more likely to transfer in prior funds of knowledge and identity. But they argue that because of power and privilege, minoritized students are still likely to be positioned out of disciplinary discourse. And they run through each of the 4 PDE design principles and explain why the research on the reality of schools for minoritized students, why that's not likely to happen. For example, in the first design principle in PDE is you want students to problematize from their own perspective. They point out that in doing so, challenging dominant ways of knowing can lead to racial controversies that actually aren't productive for learning. They argue that social authority might overwhelm intellectual authority, that gaining authority is easier than maintaining accountability, and that minoritized students might struggle to access majoritized resources. In response, they introduced the CPDE design principles, and they revisit each of those design principles. First and foremost, use socio-political controversies to problematize content. So when teachers do this, it enables them to reposition minoritized students as being relatively expert. If you use, for instance, issues of racism and social justice to problematize disciplinary content, minoritized students have de facto expertise on those topics. That in turn makes it possible to curb undue social authority and sets a stage to ensure equitable accountability of holding students responsible for diverse forms of knowing. And then finally, treating these socio-political controversies as resources to accomplish those first 3 goals. So I know my talk is running long. I want to ask you to bear with me. I think this is probably one of the most important contributions that we made in our chapter and in this presentation, and they really underpin our new model of assessment. So Engel et al. Articulate 5 elegant explanations, theoretical explanations of why expansive framing should support transfer. And what we do in our chapter is take each of these explanations and extend it using the CPDE principle. So the first explanation is that expansive framing, pushing students to make connections with people, places, topics, and times beyond the instruction, should create more intercontextuality between settings, between prior settings and future transfer settings. So if you use the CPDE principles to reposition minoritized learners and encourage them to transfer in funds of knowledge and identity, it's likely to foster even more intercontextuality. The second explanation is that expansive framing will lead students more likely to recognize the relevance of learned content in the transfer context. So if you do foster intercontextuality, when they get to transfer context, they're more likely to recognize relevance. This could be majoritized context and minoritized context. Now, the open question is whether within those majoritized contexts, whether this is likely to lead to increased transfer in testing contexts. That's an open question that we'd like to explore empirically. The third explanation of transfer in expansive framing is that students will recognize that their prior experiences are socially desirable. So if you effectively use socio-political controversies to problematize course content, the unique perspective that minoritized students will bring by definition should be more socially desirable and more valuable. The fourth explanation of expansive framing is that holding students accountable to their participation in disciplinary discourse should foster ownership of content. Students will feel like they own the ideas that they're authoring when they make these connections between course content and their own perspectives. And we think that this should support authority over content in both minoritized contexts as well as majoritized contexts. Finally, if you give students extensive experience in authoring knowledge, if you're effective at positioning them as accountable authors, that should generalize to other contexts more broadly. So this should support persistence in the face of difficulty. We think that this has particular implications for minoritized students entering into majoritized contexts where persistence is absolutely critical. And maintaining a voice in the face of what really might be some very challenging circumstances. So the final part is this sort of vision of culturally sustaining assessment. So essentially what we're doing here is using CPDE to extend the multi-level assessment model that emerged really in the first half of my career. And that model, we embedded Engel's expansive framing within that multi-level assessment in a framework that's primarily been used for online learning that we call participatory learning and assessment. So in this framework, we're essentially extending the PLA engagement routines with socio-political controversies, encouraging the use of immediate level feedback to reposition minoritized students, and a different approach to formative assessments. On one hand, we include cultural engagement as part of a reflection, a close level reflection, but we're also exploring informative classroom assessments, including socio-political controversies, and then focusing on intercontextuality, making sure that students are making connections between their funds of identity and knowledge and course concepts, and that being a really central function of formative assessment. And then encouraging teachers to provide assessment feedback that repositions minoritized students as authorities and curbs undue social authority. Finally, within the classroom, we suggest transforming proximal summative assessments and really holding all students accountable for both majoritized and minoritized ways of knowing. We think that this juxtaposition of putting majoritized, minoritized representations of knowledge side by side will help educators and students and possibly parents and researchers recognize the inherent bias in what are ostensibly culturally neutral assessments. And then finally, we want to ensure that success on existing relevant distal achievement tests. It may be a bridge too far to change those. That's really beyond the scope of our chapter, but at minimum, we suggests that teachers should acknowledge the bias while accommodating the inevitability of these tests and their function as gateways to valued opportunities. What are the practical issues? Well, we think that the engagement reflections, we advance an alternative grading practice, in, really giving students the majority of their points for engagement rather than knowing. It really might, it eliminates some onerous grading practices, but also might curtail discriminatory grading practices. Second, right, there's a lot of professional development and professional learning communities happening around formative assessment. We think that that's probably a very promising venue for introducing culturally sustaining assessment, really organizing such formative assessment around the 4 levels we presented previously. Further, we think that it's crucial to curtail achievement test preparation. It's just a terrible use of valuable classroom time, and it's really been documented. It's really overused in minority-serving institutions, and we think that all of that time should be redirected and devoted to culturally sustaining assessment practices. These so-called interim assessments that are widely marketed to schools and arguably misused and used to track students instead should be used to evaluate the effectiveness of culturally sustaining assessments in order to ensure that all students succeed on high stakes tests. We further argue that this work would be best carried out in using design-based implementation research methods within research practice partnerships. And again, really fundamentally embracing a situative theory of learning. Finally, serendipity. Very excited about this new Assessment for Good initiative that was announced just last month from the Advanced Educational Research and Development Fund, or ARDIF, which is funded by Gates, Zuckerberg, and Walton. This is sort of a new think tank, and Assessment for Good is intended to advance the capabilities needed in a responsive and accessible system of asset-based assessment. Quite excited about this. The request for information is due in October. What they're requesting are short-term 12-month sort of fast-track proposals, small proposals to explore tests of concepts. And so I'm working on a proposal with the Imperial County Office of Education on just such a proposal and hoping that that is successful. Thank you very much for listening through this admittedly lengthy talk. The chapter is currently in review. I'll be very excited to see what our esteemed reviewers have to say about these ideas. I'd love to hear from you. Again, my email address is dthickey, and here are the references that we cited in this presentation. Thank you very much. I'll leave those up for a little longer. And goodbye.